go. Is my mic on? Yes, it is. Okay. I might turn it off though, just so my comments don't. Well, maybe I will just put my commentary in. All right. Let's talk. Russia is not the boogeyman. Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. Russia is no longer a communist state trying to take over the world and all of Western Europe. My videos have been really bad lately, so and I know that because I'm like, my emotions are, I'm a little bit cuckoo right now because of some actually very, very serious matters. Very serious matters. But I want to get this out there. This is very good information. I hope you enjoy it. I want you to pay close attention. Okay. Let's have a little history lesson, not a history, a geopolitical lesson.
Scott, and I mean, it's something, the danger ain't over because they haven't admitted. Now, don't get me wrong. It's like a chess game. You can get to a point in chess or checkers or whatever, where you look up and you're like, oh, crap. And everybody on both sides knows this game's over. If I make another move, you're going to make that move and I'm going to lose. If I make this move, there's no scenario which I don't lose. It's checkmate. We just haven't called it that yet. And that's where we are. But it's dangerous because at some point the rubber meets the road and everybody looks and goes, and all of these people that have been told for the last umpteen X amount of years, Russia's weak, Ukraine's winning, we need to keep this going so the Ukraine can hold off and blah, blah, blah. And at some point, everybody's going to look at the leaders and say, hey, you told us that Russia couldn't win. The Ukraine's collapsed. You know what I'm saying? God knows the crazies in Ukraine could say, hey, we'll just blow up a nuclear power plant since we lost. We're going to come to that point. And it's critical that we start having a discussion about the truth about it. And I'm glad to hear Tucker Carlson do that. Your thoughts, Scott?
Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, Tucker's speaking fact. First of all, let's start with
Tucker knows all this shit, so don't get me going on him. Because that is somebody who is, if you can't see that guy is a fucking deep state plant operative who has been involved in color revolutions and coups and government overthrows, please think again. And the folksy thing with the blue and white checkered shirt makes me want to, like, every cell in my body goes, oh, every time I see him. And then he sits there with his arms crossed, and then he takes his brows and furrows them. And I mean, honey, that dude's been in the school. He's straight out of the State Department / Langley. Okay, let's keep going.
Statements of fact. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is a proxy war. It's a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Ukraine is the proxy. Not Scott Ritter saying that. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States of America. He said, now I've said it earlier. In fact, I was put on a Ukrainian death list for daring to say that there was a proxy conflict back in 2022. And I was, that's a Kremlin talking point. Scott Ritter's a Russian agent. New York Times just published an article that basically articulated everything that I said as fact, that we were running this war from the very beginning. This was a proxy conflict from the very beginning. Now, the whole goal in this proxy conflict was to create a scenario that sort of fulfilled the vision set forth by George Soros in a 1993 article where he talked about the future of the world in a post-Soviet environment. And he said that the West will always need Russia as a threat. Always need Russia as a threat.
Did you hear that?
Articulated everything that I said as fact, that we were running this war from the very beginning. This was a proxy conflict from the very beginning. Now, the whole goal in this proxy conflict was to create a scenario that sort of fulfilled the vision set forth by George Soros in a 1993 article where he talked about the future of the world in a post-Soviet environment. And he said that the West will always need Russia as a threat. Always.
Okay. The West will always need Russia as a threat. You know what? I'm going to sneeze, so I'll keep.
Need Russia as a threat. But the problem is, if you articulate Russia as a threat, and the only solution you have is NATO armies or American armies, then the body bags become a problem. You see, then the body bags come home, and nobody wants the war where American and NATO body bags are coming home. So he said the solution is for NATO to develop a source of Eastern European manpower that is then empowered with Western technology to fight the Russians so that when the body bags come home, they're Eastern European body bags. And that's exactly what Ukraine is. This is something that's been long in planning, ladies and gentlemen. This didn't just happen out of the blue. And when I've been saying,
the planning began under Clinton. It could have been HW, but I mean, Clinton was there implementing it and accelerating it and designing it. The people especially people in Europe, thinking that Clinton, Obama, and Michelle Obama, and Hillary, and all these people, oh, they're so good, they're so famous, no, they're not. If you lived in the U.S., you would be like freaked out by both of by the 16-year term that they put in and how they completely fucked this country up. All right, I will try to be quiet.
And others have been saying that Russia didn't start this war. They didn't. This is a war that's been in the planning stage for a long time now by the West. It's a war of the collective West against Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy. The other thing we need to realize is that Ukraine was never supposed to win. I just want people to understand that too. There was never a war-winning strategy put forward. You see that it's sort of hinted at in the New York Times article because the Ukrainians were, frustrated. We want to do this. We want to win. And everybody's going, nah, hold back. Boom. The goal was never to defeat Ukraine or to defeat Russia. The goal was for Russia to collapse through the combined effects of economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the political unrest that would accrue when the bite of sanctions brought down the standard of living, brought down the economy. The goal was to create a Moscow Maidan moment where the people of Russia rose up and took down Vladimir Putin, because that's what this is all about, ladies and gentlemen. It's about getting rid of Vladimir Putin and replacing him with a compliant Russian leader, sort of like Boris Yeltsin 2.0, that will return Russia from this status that it enjoys today of a strong, independent, self-sufficient nation to a nation dependent upon the West, compliant to the West, and oppressed by the West. That's what the decade.
So when Scott says oppressed by the West, I will go a step further and say abused by the West, used by the West, raped by the West, fucked over by the West. They don't want that there. They like their country. They like the Russian Federation. They are self-sufficient. Biden put sanctions. People rose up and began their own businesses. And they're better than the ones that were there that were American. So, okay. And they work and they put jobs in there and people making money, and then that's being spent, and subsequently their economy has become self-sufficient and strong. And Biden really fuck this one up, boy. Biden, Blinken, Newland, boy, they had their plan in place, but I don't think any of them were ever smart enough to pull it off. They never quite, they did not succeed.
Decade of the 1990s was. So that's what this is all about. They didn't have a plan B because this was never supposed to be about a Ukrainian military victory. It was supposed to be about wearing Russia down. Russia won. I mean, war is an extension of politics by other means, and you can't just look at the battlefield. You look at the totality of things. Tucker Carlson is saying that Russia has won this war. I've been saying Russia has won this war. Garland's been saying Russia has won this war because Russia has won this war. They've won it militarily, but perhaps more importantly, they've won it economically. They're not suffering from these sanctions. In fact, their economy continues to grow at a robust rate. They've reconfigured their economy. I mean, it's interesting now when we talk about the return of Western companies to Russia, and the Western companies are lining up saying, we want to get back into that, $100 billion plus market. And the Russians saying, no. You see, you left. And we rebuilt our economy. We now have Russian companies that have been formed that have stepped in, and they're doing what you did, and they're doing it better, and the money stays in Russia, and we're not going to screw these companies by saying, no, you come in and compete with them. So if you made the decision to leave, it's your problem, not our problem. And the Russian economy is robust right now. It doesn't need the West. This is real. Politically speaking, prior to the special military operation, Vladimir Putin was a 63% kind of guy. What I mean by that is you have a national election and Vladimir Putin wins 63% of the vote. And then you have another, 30 some odd percent that gets, goes to the Communist Party and the opposition.
Yeah, the Communist Party was the number two party, and the Communist Party people didn't like Putin. And then after you know what the biggest thing they were angry at him about? I've talked to a lot of, what the biggest thing the Communist Party was angry about him? About Ukraine. They wanted him to go in years ago. So if you think about it, the pushback that he was getting in Russia was because he wouldn't go into Ukraine earlier. That's what people won't accept. How is he going to collapse for going in Ukraine when his biggest opposition was because he wouldn't go in Ukraine? That's important. Well,
but there was a problem here because, when you look at the way the domestic politics of Russia were, they're tied to the economy. James Carville's 1992 maxim that he gave to Bill Clinton in that election, it's the economy, stupid, applies globally. It's the economy, stupid. And so here you are, you're Vladimir Putin, and you have an economy that is about 20-30% so deeply entangled in the West that you can't separate them. And Putin knows that entanglement is what the pro-Western, leaning of this entanglement is what empowers the Nemtsovs and the Navalnys and the others, the opposition that continuously gets fed resources from Western intelligence sources and non-governmental organizations to undermine Russian. And again, I just want to point out to people, they say, well, Scott, how could you say it's about undermining Russian democracy? America promotes democracy. Well, geez, A, I've been studying this topic for a long time, but B, it helps every now and then when like the number 2 man at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, who was there in 1994, Mr. Mary, I think his name was, publishes an article. Now, he wrote what's called the second long telegram. The first one was Kennan's long telegram, 46, I believe, that led to containment. Mary wrote one in the aftermath of the great defender of democracy, Boris Yeltsin, bringing tanks into the street of Moscow and firing on the Russian parliament. Hey, how democratic is that when the president literally goes to war against the parliament? And we supported this. And then we tried to cook up an election in 94, and we lost. The others got there. And so he wrote a warning. He said, we've put political and economic gain. We put economic gain ahead of doing the right thing by Russia. He said, Russia right now in a moment where we should be promoting democracy. We should be helping Russia build institutions for democracy. And instead, we're literally suppressing them because we want to keep this guy Yeltsin in power, who is a very undemocratic leader. And in 94, we cooked it. 96, we bought an election. We bragged about it. New York, the Time magazine cover, the best election money can buy. We bought an election in Russia. That's what we did in the 1990s. We destroyed Russian democracy by not allowing it to ever develop. We backed Russian dictators. We call Putin a dictator. Boris Yeltsin was a Russian dictator backed by the United States. But his job wasn't to make Russia strong. It was to tear Russia down, to allow America in, to empower oligarchs, which is the other thing that people tend to forget about.
Sort of reminds me of Obama, doesn't it?
That Russia was heavily dominated economically by, these oligarchs who went in the post, communist era and gained access to all of these state monopolies and turned them into, private monopolies. And then they made hundreds of billions of dollars that they took out of the country that didn't get fed back into Russia. Russia was a basket case. And Vladimir Putin's been fighting against that narrative, against that momentum to rebuild Russia ever since. And we don't like it. We don't like it. The Russia reset of 2008, you might remember that, where Obama, got Hillary Clinton to meet with Sergei Lavrov, and she brought in this little box with a red button, and they're Yanks to the rescue, the best election we could buy. And they were supposed to push it, and instead of saying reset, it said overcharged, and Lavrov went, sort of the opposite of what we want to do. But the point is, that wasn't about restoring relations. It was about regime change. The entire reset policy was about keeping Vladimir Putin out because he had 2 terms, served it constitutionally. That's all he could serve. So he did a little swap with Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev became president. Putin became prime minister. The goal was at the end of that, swap back. I'm not saying that's how democracy is supposed to work. I'm saying that's the reality of it because Putin understood that the West was trying to bring him down, bring Russia down, to tear it down. And he said, we can't let this happen. We can't be normal and step aside and let other forces come in because there is no other force. The democratic opposition that was supposed to be built naturally, that Putin praised in the potential in 2004, 2005, was CIA backed for the sole purpose of bringing down the Russian government. And so they did the little swap. And what Michael McFaul advised Obama is, we need to keep Medvedev in and keep Putin out. And we do this by what we call the reset. But the reset was simply to bribe Medvedev to renege on the deal of swapping back, to keep Medvedev in power and push Putin out. It got so ridiculous that in 2011, Joe Biden, who was then the vice president, flew to Moscow on the eve of these elections and had a meeting with the Russian opposition in Moscow and said, it's not going to be good for Russia or Vladimir Putin if he runs for president again. We strongly advise him not to do that. Could you imagine a Russian leader flying to America and meeting with the opposite? Let's say, the next election comes up. Dmitry Medvedev flies to America and meets with the Democratic Party and says it wouldn't be good for America or for J.D. Vance to run in. It'd be very bad for them. You think Americans would go, oh, thank you. Did you mean? Well, maybe the Democrats might, but the point is, you don't interfere in elections this way. But that's what we did. We interfered in these elections. So this war was always about regime change, about getting rid of Vladimir Putin, and they failed. They failed. And so that means we lost the war. And now we have to live with the consequences of that. This was never about military power versus military power. This was never about NATO bringing forward its capabilities to decisively confront Russia. This was about using Ukraine as a proxy to wear Russia down. We didn't care about Ukrainian casualties. Hell, the thing was designed with the Soros vision in mind of the body bags being Eastern European, therefore they don't matter. And they don't. We can give lip service all we want. How many Americans shed tears over the 1.1 million Ukrainian soldiers that have died so far? Nobody gives a damn about them. It's a number we throw around haphazardly. Even Donald Trump claims to care about them. We don't. He's the guy that sent the javelins and the stingers to set this whole thing up in 2016. Donald Trump, we built training facilities in Western Ukraine in 2015. The U.S. Army brags about it. We're training 1 battalion of Ukrainian soldiers to NATO standards every 55 days so they can go and kill Russians over in the east. And we've been doing that nonstop since 2015. Donald Trump was elected in 2006. He became president in 2017, and he inherited that program, and he didn't shut it down and say, this is stupid. Why are we encouraging war with Russia? He doubled down on stupid and gave them javelins and stingers and promoted this as robust American policy. So Trump doesn't care about Ukrainian life. Nobody cares about Ukrainian life, except maybe the Russians. They may be the only power out there that actually gives a damn about the Ukrainians because this war pains them. The Ukrainians are fellow Slavs, and this is like a civil war, brother against brother, cousin against cousin. The Russians appear to be the only ones who care about Ukrainian life. Europe certainly doesn't. They want this war to continue. They're encouraging more Ukrainians. They're asking Ukraine to mobilize their 18-year-olds to finish the last genetic, base foundation upon which Ukraine could possibly rebuild. They want to slaughter them as well so that Ukraine simply disappears as a nation state. We have lost this war, and there's nothing that can be done to retrieve it. NATO as an institution is incapable of marshaling military power sufficient to take on the Russians. I just throw out a historical analogy here. In 1942, Germany continued their big offensive against Russia. They started with their offensive in their counteroffensive in Kharkov. The Russians launched a big spring offensive. The Russians absorbed it and then sent their counterattack. And they drove on towards Stalingrad, then up into the Caucasus. And this was supposed to be the knockout blow. To do this, Russia needed the help of the Hungarians and the Romanians. And the Romanians mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops, and the Hungarians mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops, and off they went. Big masses of army. A lot of numbers there. But when the Soviets counterattacked, they hit the Romanians and the Hungarians first. They collapsed like a house of cards because they couldn't fight. The German army could fight, but now they're in a desperate situation because the flanks have collapsed, and now they have to move back and try and cover this. So they left the 6th Army in Stalingrad. 4th Panzer Army came back, was fighting this mobile action, and they barely were able to survive. They lost the 6th Army, lost the Battle of Stalingrad. The reason why I bring this up is people keep talking about NATO's numbers. Let's just say hypothetically that NATO decided to intervene with the core of American troops. So we've got big, strong, viable American army, and we're pretty damn good. We can fight in high-intensity conflict. We're trained. We have the equipment. We have the doctrine, the whole thing. And to our left are the Poles. There are hundreds of thousands of them. And to our right are the Romanians, and there's 100,000 of them. There's some French and some British scattered around there. And we start fighting the Russians. Well, first thing that's going to happen is the Poles are going to collapse like a house of cards. That's not me saying it, ladies and gentlemen. The Polish High Command came out and said, what the hell are we doing? If we go to war against Russia, we run out of ammunition in 14 days. And let me give you a pro hint. You run out of ammunition in a high-intensity conflict, you sort of lost the war. You're dead. So the Poles are gone. The Romanians don't even have 14 days worth of ammunition. They're not even going to get out. They're going to be just running around with their heads up their butts because they don't know how to do this kind of stuff, and they're gone. The French, they're dead. The British, they die valiantly, and they're all dead. And the Americans are left alone, like the 4th Panzer Army, and they'll be maneuvering around, but we don't have any reserves. See, the Germans, as the 4th Panzer got spun out, were able to mobilize divisions, pull divisions out of Sicily, pull divisions elsewhere, pour them in to stabilize the front. We don't have anything left. We don't have anything to reinforce. So as our military gets ground down, there's nothing to reinforce, and we get beat. That's the reality of the situation in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, we lost this war. We lost it based upon the design, and we don't have the ability to redesign a conflict that we can compete against the Russians. They have the world's largest, most combat-hardened military that's out there. There's nothing that can stand toe-to-toe with them. The second most capable military is the Ukrainian military, and they're being slaughtered on the battlefield. No other military can survive against the Russians. I'll leave you with this. I keep saying I'll leave you with that, but then I get another thought. The Marine Corps, and I love the Marine Corps. They've just created what they call the Marine. Basically, it's a combat drone unit, and they've created this unit, and the idea is to bring the first-person FPV drones the suicide drones, the attack drones, into Marine Corps combat capabilities, because this is the future of war. This is the future.
Right.
And so
it's the present. Look, how about this? It's the present of war in Ukraine. Those guys know how to fight it. It's the future of war for us because we're learning it. It's the present for those guys because they are masters of it because they got to fight it every day. I just put it a little different way.
No, but that's the truth. The Marine Corps is saying we can't survive on a battlefield if we don't have this capability. Because it is now not just a weapon, it's part of maneuver. If you don't have the ability to use drones as a weapon to suppress the enemy, to create opportunities for advance, to cover your advance, drones are a weapon system now. And if you don't know how to do it, if you go up against an enemy that does know how to do it, you're going to get wiped out. Look, the Ukrainians right now in certain areas on the battlefield have brought the Russians to a standstill. I saw this video, it was just, distressingly fascinating. You have a Russian tank advancing, and literally, as it's moving forward 100 meters, it gets hit 15 times by drones. As it moves, the Ukrainians just bring them up like a hornet's nest. Bam, 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 bam. And it doesn't matter how many nets you have on it. Eventually, bam, a chink in the armor, bam, immobilized, bam, dead. Everybody in that vehicle was killed. You have times on the battlefield now for the Russians to move forward and do their rotation or to bring in food and all that. The infantry literally has to crawl 1.5 kilometers and pray they don't get seen by the Ukrainian drones, because if the Ukrainian drones spot you, you're dead. That's just the reality of the war today. So this, I have to turn off your comments because I'm not a fighter, not just a talker, not a fighter. Meet me anytime you want, bastard, and I'll knock the shit out of you. And I'm sorry, I turned it off, but I hate
the chat is.
So it's done.
I would say this. It's you know what I say about the chat. Well, the guys at Langley got to get paid too. You know what I mean? Let's not get mad at the guys.
The guys at Langley know that if they stood up with me, they'd die because they've tried it in the past. You know, I may be old, but I mean, it just pisses me off because they don't know what they're talking about. I don't like to say anything, but that's why my wife told me to turn them off a long time ago. I thought I monitored the pulse of the chat, but I saw that, and it's like waving a red flag in front of a bull. Just a talker, not a fighter. I'll show you what a talker can do. But
you know what? So let me real quick. I'll tell you. See, here's what people always try to do with me. I guess I call them the agents or the bots. They always try to bring up the issue of race. Well, black people this or white people this, and I just say, yeah, whatever. I ain't talking about it. Right. I literally had a guy say, oh, yeah, black, blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, I don't want to talk about the race stuff. He goes, you're a race baiter. And I'm like, yeah, I still ain't talking about the race stuff. People are looking for points. And I feel like a lot of them are, let's face it, they pay a lot of people to be on these chats, to be on Facebook. A while back, it came back that the Pentagon had 50 or 60,000 people that they paid 60,000 just to be online doing that kind of crap day or night. And when I saw that the Gray Zone did, and when I saw that, I'm like, sons of bitches, I should have known. At that point, I decided they'll never get me. But anyway,
trying to grab a wedge between you and me. I mean, just this past week, there's people out there, Garland and Scott, they hate each other, and Garland's doing this to Scott and Scott's doing this to Garland, and I'm like, what?
Sure, yeah, sure. Whatever makes
anything about Garland and I, okay.
Yeah. But that's the game out there, But at any rate, the other thing I wanted to say, because we got a couple more minutes, and I wanted to touch this. So here's what he says. In response, Carlson. This is the last part of what Tucker Carlson did that I don't want to miss. Carlson referenced a Pentagon assessment indicating that at one point, the risk of the Ukraine conflict escalating to nuclear war reached 50%, arguing that any policymaker comfortable with such odds belongs in prison for the Kremlin insane. And now apparently it's come out now, Pentagon said, imagine that. Imagine that, everybody who's out there in the chat, everybody you know, when you go to the a convenience store on the corner, the 16-year-old kid that's working there selling you stuff, when you go to McDonald's, when you go to the car wash, somebody washing your car, when you call your aunt that you haven't talked in a long time, hey, Aunt so-and-so. These people had gotten to the point where everybody you know has a 50-50 chance of living. And they continued with that.
Yeah.
You're right. I'll put it like that. They say they should be in prison for the criminally insane. Because I am a person of somewhat integrity and somewhat reserved, I won't say what I think should have happened to him. But trust me, it ain't a prison for the criminally insane. But that people don't understand the level of danger these people play with, Scott.
There's a criminal charge, terroristic threats. And I'm not an expert on it, but I know people have been arrested for making terroristic threats. So if I go to the mall and stand up and I'm going to shut this thing down and burn down that building, kill everybody inside, even though I don't have matches on me or anything,
Exactly.
gasoline or nothing, I'm still going to be arrested for making terroristic threats. So now you have the government, and again, I think it's more than 50%, because let me tell you why.
Oh, yes.
In November, you had the man who wrote the war plan, the rear admiral who wrote the war plan, talk and say, we're ready to go to nuclear war with Russia. We're comfortable with that. We've come up with an exchange. An exchange is a new exchange of nuclear weapons that we feel we can prevail. We can win a nuclear war. And I'm like, that's wrong. But I mean, you should be arrested for.
How about this? Theodore Apostol, one of the most accomplished scholars on earth on this particular subject, disagrees with you, and he's a physicist.
Yeah. Well, we can't win the war. But here's the other thing that happened, though, at that time, because that was in November. At that time, the New York Times and Washington Post were running around saying, and again, this is why, ladies and gentlemen, don't believe the New York Times and the Washington Post. Even if they tell the truth, it's because they're spinning something, because they probably previously lied. But the New York Times and Washington Post back then were saying that the CIA's assessment of Russia's new nuclear doctrine is that the Russians are bluffing. This is all a bluff. And therefore, we can take everything with a grain of salt because Russia will never take it to that level. But then I went and met with a very senior Democrat, not a Republican, a Democrat, because remember, in December, this is the time when Biden's still in office. And I said, I know you can't talk about classified things, and I'm not asking, but, what's your feeling about the Russians? Are they're bluffing and all this kind of stuff? And he said, Scott, that the New York Times got it wrong. He said, I was at that briefing. And what I can tell you is that the CIA said the Russians aren't bluffing. The exact opposite, that the Russians aren't bluffing. But he said, that's not the scary thing. The scary thing was that the senior Biden administration people present at the briefing went, that's okay. Neither are we.
God help me. Hey, you guys. Okay, I think I'm going to end this here. But did you sort of get an understanding of what's going on that you're not going to get from the MSM? The real deal here, the real history. It takes a while to put this stuff together, but once you do, you look at I feel so much, like I'm not afraid of anyone. I'm not afraid of China. I'm not afraid of Russia. I'm not afraid of some boogeyman. All right. Okay.